In the golden age of the 1990s, the word supermodel carried almost mythical weight. Naomi Campbell, Cindy Crawford, and Tyra Banks seemed untouchable, their beauty eternalized on billboards and magazine covers. And into this pantheon stepped Beverly Peele, a girl barely in her teens, yet already hailed as the next great icon. By the age of 14, she was conquering Vogue and Elle. Designers whispered her name. Photographers chased her. She was supposed to be unstoppable. But behind the flashbulbs and the applause, her story was already taking a darker turn. At just 17, when the runway was still wide open before her, Beverly stunned the world with a revelation. She was pregnant. In an industry obsessed with selling fantasy, the reality of a teenage mother was not just unexpected, it was unforgivable. Overnight, contracts disappeared. Friends turned distant. The girl who had been celebrated as the face of youth and glamour was suddenly cast as an outsider, her choices branded as scandal rather than strength. And yet, the pregnancy was only the beginning. The years that followed would unravel into financial struggles, whispers of exploitation, courtroom battles, and moments so dark that even Beverly herself would later describe them as unbearable. There were rumors of betrayals by the very people who once praised her, speculation about relationships that left scars, and stories of an industry all too willing to discard her once the illusion of perfection cracked. Then came the moment that could have ended it all. In 2010, Beverly was involved in a devastating car accident. An accident so severe that reports described her as fighting for her life. For days, fans and fashion insiders whispered, would she survive? If she did, would the world even care? She did survive, but survival came at a cost. The woman who had once ruled the runway now faced the haunting reality of near death, her life a far cry from the glamorous string she had once embodied. What makes Beverly's story so gripping is not only the speed of her rise or the brutality of her fall. It's the silence that followed. Unlike her peers who managed to reinvent themselves, Beverly disappeared into the shadows, resurfacing only when tragedy forced her name back into the headlines. Her tale is not one of glory, but of what happens when a dream collides with reality, when beauty is celebrated and then punished, when the industry demands perfection and abandons those who reveal their humanity. This is the story of Beverly Peele, once crowned the next Naomi Campbell, then cast aside as a scandal, nearly erased by tragedy, and remembered today more as a haunting question than a lasting icon. Was she a victim of her own choices, or of an industry that devours its stars the moment they stumble? And perhaps most chilling of all, how many other Beverly Peeles has the fashion world already forgotten? Beverly Peele's beginnings were as ordinary as any American teenager of the 1980s. Born in Los Angeles in 1975, she grew up in a world far removed from the couture gowns and flashing cameras that would later define her life. She was the daughter of a working-class family, a girl with a striking presence but without the privileges or connections that so often paved the way in fashion. Yet, from an early age, Beverly's tall frame and distinctive features caught attention. There was something magnetic about her, an aura that suggested she was destined for a stage much larger than the one she had been born into. By the time she was just 12 years old, Beverly had already stepped into the world of modeling. Most girls her age were focused on school dances or sleepovers, but Beverly was standing under blinding studio lights, listening to photographers shout instructions in rapid succession. What began as a chance opportunity quickly became a career. Her face, with its blend of youthful innocence and commanding intensity, was unlike anything the industry had seen. Agencies rushed to sign her, sensing the potential for stardom. Her rise was astonishingly swift. At only 14, Beverly landed the cover of Mademoiselle, an achievement that many models could only dream of after years of struggling. For her, it came almost effortlessly, as though the universe had tilted in her favor. Soon after, she graced the pages of Vogue and Elle, instantly cementing herself as one of the youngest models ever to conquer the world's most influential fashion publications. Her career was not climbing, it was exploding. Designers were quick to take notice. Beverly was not merely a pretty face, she was a presence. On the runway, she exuded both elegance and edge, a combination that made her irresistible to houses like Ralph Lauren, Versace, and Chanel. She could embody high glamour in one moment and rebellious cool the next. In an industry always searching for the new face, Beverly Peele seemed to be the face of the future. Her youth only amplified the fascination. Here was a teenager commanding the same runways as seasoned supermodels, yet never looking out of place. Beverly carried herself with a poise beyond her years, captivating audiences and photographers alike. She became one of the few young black models to achieve such rapid prominence, standing shoulder to shoulder with icons like Naomi Campbell and paving the way for others who would follow. But beneath the triumphs, there was another reality. Beverly was still a child in many ways, thrust into an adult world of relentless schedules, ruthless expectations, and constant scrutiny. The glamour came at a price. Long hours, little privacy, and the constant pressure to embody perfection. The fashion world saw her as a star, but it rarely paused to consider the weight placed on such young shoulders. The industry demanded not only beauty, but endurance, and it offered little room for mistakes. Yet for a brief, dazzling moment, Beverly Peele seemed unstoppable. She was the teenage dream made real, a symbol of the new wave of supermodels reshaping the 1990s. From the outside, her life looked like a fairy tale. Luxury, fame, and the promise of immortality in an industry that immortalized faces. But like so many fairy tales, shadows were already lurking at the edges. While Beverly's rise was meteoric, it also left her vulnerable, exposed to the darker truths of fashion where innocence could be exploited and success could vanish in the blink of an eye. What no one could have imagined was how quickly the dream would fracture and how a single personal decision would change the trajectory of her life forever. By the early 1990s, Beverly Peele was living the kind of dream that millions of young girls could only fantasize about. She was not just working in fashion, she was dominating it. The covers of Vogue, Elle, and Mademoiselle were not occasional triumphs. They became regular appearances. Photographers like Steven Meisel and Patrick de Marchelier sought her out, captivated by the way she could transform in front of the lens. Beverly didn't just wear the clothes, she inhabited them, turning fabric and seams into stories that captivated audiences across the world. Her runway presence was equally unforgettable. Draped in the sleek minimalism of Ralph Lauren one season, then reborn in the opulent drama of Versace the next, Beverly was versatile in a way that made her indispensable. When she walked, the room shifted. Designers whispered her name, casting agents took notes, and journalists called her the next Naomi Campbell. For a girl barely out of her teens, this was not only an honor, but a heavy mantle. The fashion industry of the 1990s was in the midst of its golden era, and Beverly Peele was at its center. She became one of the few black models to achieve mainstream international recognition, breaking barriers while inspiring a new generation. Her career coincided with a moment when supermodels were not just models, they were celebrities, commanding attention far beyond the runway. Beverly walked beside giants, Cindy, Christy, Linda, Naomi, and Tyra. She was no longer an up-and-comer, she was one of them. This was the Beverly Peele that the public saw, a young woman bathed in luxury, celebrated at fashion weeks from Paris to Milan, and immortalized in glossy spreads that promised for beauty would never fade. To the outside world, she was the embodiment of glamour, young, stunning, and seemingly untouchable. Her life looked like perfection incarnate, wrapped in haute couture. But perfection in fashion is always a carefully curated illusion. Behind the dazzling lights and the applause, Beverly was fighting to keep up with the relentless pace of superstardom. The pressure to maintain her weight, her look, her presence, it was unyielding. She was constantly reminded that in fashion, you are only as good as your last show, your last photograph, your last headline. At an age when most young women are still discovering who they are, Beverly was expected to be flawless, disciplined, and endlessly marketable. Still, the world could not get enough of her. Every new campaign only fueled the obsession. She appeared in ad after ad, becoming the face of youth and beauty for brands eager to capture the zeitgeist. Her face was everywhere, on billboards and magazines and in store windows across continents. For Beverly, fame had arrived at a speed that left no time for hesitation. The industry had crowned her, and now it demanded that she reign. And reign she did. For a brief, breathtaking stretch of time, Beverly Peele was not just a model, she was a phenomenon. She embodied the glamour of the 1990s when supermodels were larger than life, their names as recognizable as movie stars. Her youth was her asset, her beauty her passport, and her presence her power. But beneath the shimmering surface, cracks had already begun to form. While the cameras adored her, Beverly was balancing the weight of expectations no teenager should ever carry. The glamour was intoxicating, but it was also fragile, built on conditions that could change overnight. For Beverly, the fall would come not from the runway, but from her own life, an unexpected twist that would shock the fashion world and permanently alter her destiny. For the fashion world, Beverly Peele seemed invincible. She was young, beautiful, and at the height of her career. Yet behind the flawless magazine covers and the shimmering runways, a storm was quietly forming, one that would reveal just how fragile even the brightest stars could be. In 1992, at just 17 years old, Beverly's life changed forever. The young model, barely on the cusp of adulthood, discovers she was pregnant. For most teenagers, such news would be overwhelming. For a supermodel whose career depended on projecting an image of carefree glamour, it was nothing short of explosive. The revelation did not stay private for long. Soon, whispers spread across the industry. Beverly Peele, the teenage star of Vogue and Versace, was going to be a mother. The reaction was swift and brutal. Fashion, at its core, sells fantasy. It thrives on illusions of perfection, youth, and unattainable beauty. A teenage mother did not fit the script. Designers who once praised her suddenly hesitated. Campaigns evaporated. Calls stopped coming. It was as if the industry had decided, almost overnight, that Beverly's narrative no longer matched the dream they wanted to sell. For Beverly, the choice to embrace motherhood was deeply personal. But the cost was devastating. She became a mother to her daughter, Angela, while still practically a child herself. The industry's rejection was not just professional, it was personal. To them, Beverly had broken the illusion. She was no longer the untouchable muse, but a reminder of vulnerability, of reality intruding into fantasy. The toll was immense. Friends and insiders recalled a shift in tone, how Beverly, once celebrated as the next Naomi Campbell, suddenly became a cautionary tale whispered in fashion circles. She was portrayed as reckless, as though her decision to keep her child was a scandal rather than a human choice. For a young woman still discovering herself, the weight of this judgment was crushing. And yet the deeper tragedy lay in how little support she received. At 17, Beverly was thrust into the dual roles of supermodel and single mother, a balancing act few could survive. The glamour that once defined her life gave way to sleepless nights, mounting bills, and the harsh reality of raising a child alone. In interviews years later, Beverly would admit that the pressures were immense, that the fairy tale of modeling had dissolved into something far less forgiving. The cracks in her image widened. She was no longer the darling of designers, but an outsider, fighting to reclaim relevance in an industry that had moved on without her. The pregnancy, which should have been a personal milestone, became the turning point that shifted her from rising star to fading light. It was not just a career setback, it was the beginning of a long unraveling, one that would eventually lead her into financial struggles, legal battles, and near-death experiences. Looking back, the story of Beverly Peele's pregnancy is both heartbreaking and revealing. It exposed the hypocrisy of fashion, a world that celebrated youth yet punished it when it strayed from the script. A world that adored its stars, but abandoned them the moment they became too human. For Beverly, becoming a mother was not a scandal. It was a life choice. But in the unforgiving arena of fashion, it became the first strike in a series of blows that would test her resilience again and again. By the late 2000s, Beverly Peele was no longer the face plastered across magazine covers. The industry that once crowned her had long moved on to newer faces, fresher names. For many, she was already a forgotten star, her story reduced to whispers about what might have been. But in 2010, fate delivered a reminder that Beverly's life was still tethered to extremes, still dancing on the thin line between glamour and tragedy. That year, she was involved in a devastating car accident. Details emerged slowly, but what was clear was this. Beverly had been gravely injured, her life hanging in the balance. The same headlines that had once celebrated her beauty now carried news of her near death. Photographs of her on the runway were suddenly juxtaposed against stories of hospital beds and recovery wards. For those who remembered her glory days, the accident was a shocking reminder of how far she had fallen. The accident did more than injure her body. It exposed the fragility of her circumstances. Recovery was not just about healing physically, but about facing the harsh reality of where her life had landed. Once surrounded by designers, photographers, and adoring fans, Beverly now found herself isolated, struggling to rebuild a life that seemed to collapse every time she found her footing. The industry that had abandoned her years earlier did not return. There were no triumphant comebacks, no glamorous magazine spreads welcoming her back. For Beverly, the accident symbolized more than a brush with death. It marked the death of her public image, the final blow to a career already fractured. She was no longer just a supermodel who had once graced Vogue. She was a cautionary tale, her name attached more to tragedy than triumph. The fashion world thrives on reinvention, but for Beverly Peele, reinvention never came. She slipped further from the spotlight, her story fading into the shadows. And yet, whispers persisted. To some, the car crash was more than an accident. It was emblematic of a life lived too fast, too hard, under the merciless expectations of an industry that chewed up its young. Others speculated about the toll her struggles had taken long before the crash, wondering if fate had simply caught up with her. The truth was less glamorous, but more devastating. Beverly had been living on the edge for years, and the accident only made visible what had long been hidden. Her near-death experience was also a reminder of the thin line between survival and disappearance. Had she not survived, Beverly Peele might have become another tragic entry in fashion's long list of gone-too-soon stars. Instead, she lived, but survival came at a cost. The years that followed were marked not by comebacks, but by obscurity, her once bright legacy dimmed to a flicker. For those who look back now, the car crash serves as a haunting metaphor. Beverly Peele, once speeding down the fast lane of fame, brought to a violent halt, left to piece together the fragments of a life that had once seemed unstoppable. She did not die that day in 2010, but in many ways, a version of Beverly Peele, the glamorous, untouchable supermodel, did. Beverly Peele's story is not the kind of legacy the fashion world prefers to celebrate. Unlike Naomi Campbell or Tyra Banks, whose names remain synonymous with glamour and longevity, Beverly's legacy is tangled, bittersweet, and often forgotten. Yet, in that very forgetting lies the truth of her impact. She is a reminder that the fashion industry has always been as brutal as it is beautiful. For those who recall her peak, Beverly Peele is remembered as the girl who had it all. The face of a generation, the teenager who conquered Vogue covers before most girls had finished high school. Her beauty was undeniable, her runway presence unforgettable. For a brief, shining moment, she embodied the dream of supermodel stardom in its purest form. And yet, that same dream unraveled before the world's eyes, leaving behind a story not of triumph, but of tragedy. Her decision to embrace motherhood at 17 remains one of the defining moments of her legacy. It was both courageous and costly. In an industry obsessed with perfection, Beverly dared to be human, and she paid the price. Today, that choice can be seen through a different lens. In a cultural climate more aware of women's struggles and rights, Beverly's story resonates differently, less as scandal, more as testimony to the impossible expectations placed on young women in fashion. She was punished for stepping outside of the fantasy, and her downfall reflects the cruelty of a system that valued the illusion over the individual. The 2010 car accident only deepened this narrative. It symbolized the fragility of her existence, a physical echo of the collapse that had already happened in her career. For some, it became the final note in her public story, the once celebrated model nearly erased by tragedy. But for others, it served as a stark lesson about survival. Beverly did not die that day, and in surviving, she carried a truth the fashion world often hides, that behind every glossy image lies a human being, vulnerable and breakable. Today, Beverly Peele's name rarely appears in the mainstream fashion conversation. She is not regularly honored in retrospectives, nor is she placed alongside the giants of her era. But among those who remember, her story endures as a cautionary tale, the meteoric rise that collapsed under the weight of real life, the girl who was too human for a world that demanded she be untouchable. Her legacy is not in the campaigns or covers that now gather dust in archives. It is in the conversation her life sparks about how the industry treats its young, its women, and its stars who dare to falter. Perhaps the cruelest part of her aftermath is how silence has replaced applause. Beverly Peele did not vanish in a blaze of glory. She faded quietly, her brilliance dimmed by time and neglect. Yet, even in obscurity, her story lingers, whispered among those who know that fashion's beauty is always shadowed by darkness. Her name may not be etched in golden letters, but it is etched in the truth of what happens when an industry obsessed with youth and perfection collides with the messy reality of life. In that way, Beverly Peele's legacy is haunting, tragic, and unforgettable. She may no longer walk the runways, but her story still walks among us, an echo of the darker side of elegance. The story of Beverly Peele is not one of a triumphant comeback or a neatly tied ending. It is the story of a girl who rose too high, too fast, only to be brought back down by the weight of reality and the merciless standards of an industry that thrives on illusion. She was not the first model to be discarded when life interfered with fantasy, and she will not be the last. But her journey, raw and unpolished, still lingers like a shadow at the edges of fashion's glittering stage. For a time, Beverly was everything the industry desired. She had the face, the body, the presence to stop a room in its tracks. She stood alongside legends, walked for houses that defined elegance, and graced covers that immortalized her beauty. But what separated her from others was not just her talent, it was her humanity. She made choices that reflected her life, not her brand. She became a mother. She survived an accident that could have ended her story forever. She lived, even when the industry seemed determined to forget her. And perhaps that is why her tale remains so haunting. Beverly Peele represents the unspoken truth that beneath the glamour, models are human beings, fragile, flawed, and vulnerable to the same storms that affect us all. The tragedy is not that she faltered, but that the world around her punished her for it, turning her into a cautionary tale rather than a celebrated survivor. In many ways, Beverly's life reflects the darker side of elegance itself. Fashion sells perfection, but perfection is impossible. When the illusion cracks, the industry looks away, leaving its stars to pick up the pieces alone. Beverly Peele was more than a cover girl. She was a young woman caught in the collision between dream and reality, between fantasy and truth. Her disappearance from the spotlight does not erase her impact, it amplifies it, reminding us of how fleeting fame can be and how ruthless the pursuit of beauty often becomes. For those who remember, Beverly Peele is not forgotten. She is the ghost of an era, a reminder of what was lost and of what remains hidden behind the glossy pages of fashion magazines. Her story challenges us to look beyond the surface, to recognize the price paid for beauty, and to question the industry that so often buries its broken stars in silence. As we close her chapter, we are left with more than nostalgia. We are left with questions. What does it truly mean to succeed in a world that devours its own? Was Beverly's downfall inevitable, or was it the result of choices she should never have had to make at such a young age? And most haunting of all, how many other Beverly Peels has the fashion world already forgotten? If you found her story moving, consider subscribing for more untold legacies, because behind every flawless photograph lies a truth waiting to be uncovered, a shadow waiting to be seen.